Public Banking TV presents China's Creative Accountants, based on China's Creative Accountants Turning Debt into an Asset, by Ellen Brown, adapted and narrated by Bob Bose. China may be as heavily in debt as we are. It just has a different way of keeping its books, which makes a high-profile political ad, sponsored by Citizens Against Government Waste, a fiscally conservative think tank, particularly ironic. Set in a lecture hall in China in 2030, the controversial ad shows a Chinese professor lecturing on the fall of empires: Greece, Rome, Great Britain, and the United States. They all make the same mistakes, he says, turning their backs on the principles that made them great. America tried to spend and tax itself out of a Great Recession. Enormous so-called stimulus spending, massive changes to health care, government takeover of private industries, and crushing debt. Of course, he says, because the Chinese own the debt, they are now masters of the Americans. The students laugh. The ad concludes, "You can change the future. You have to." James Fallows, writing in The Atlantic, remarks, "The ad has the Chinese officials saying that America collapsed because, in the midst of a recession, it relied on A. government stimulus spending, B. big changes in its healthcare systems, and C. public intervention in major industries, all of which, of course, have been crucial parts of China's successful anti-recession policy." That is one irony. Another is that China has managed to keep its debt remarkably low despite decades of massive government spending. According to the IMF, China's cumulative gross debt is only about 22% of 2010 GDP, compared to a U.S. gross debt that is 94% of 2010 GDP. What is China's secret? According to financial commentator Jim Juback, it may be just creative accounting, the sort of accounting for which Wall Street is notorious, in which debts are swept off the books and turned into assets. China is able to pull this off because it does not owe its debts to foreign creditors. The banks doing the funding are state-owned, and the state can write off its own debts. For example, the collapse of China's export trade following the Asian currency crisis of 1997 meant that its banks were suddenly sitting on billions in debts that were clearly never going to be paid. But that was when China's largest banks were trying to raise capital by selling stock in Hong Kong and New York, and no bank could go public with that much bad debt on its books. The creative solution? The Beijing government set up special-purpose asset management companies for the four largest state-owned banks, the equivalent of the special-purpose vehicles designed by Wall Street to funnel real estate loans off U.S. banks' books. The state-owned banks got $287 billion in toxic debt off their books and turned the bad loans into an income stream from the bonds. Sound familiar? Wall Street did the same thing in the 2008 bailout, with the U.S. government underwriting the deal. The difference was that China's largest banks are owned by the government, so the government, rather than a private banking cartel, got the benefit of the deal. According to British economist Sama El-Shahat, writing in Al Jazeera in August 2009, China hasn't allowed its banking sector to become so powerful, so influential, and so big that it can call the shots or hijack the bailout. In simple terms, the government preferred to answer to its people and put their interests first before that of any vested interest or group. And that is why Chinese banks are lending to the people and their businesses in record numbers. In the US and UK, by contrast, El-Shahat continues, banks have captured all the money from the taxpayers and the cheap money from quantitative easing from central banks. They are using it to shore up and clean up their balance sheets rather than lend it to the people. The money has been hijacked by the banks, and our governments are doing absolutely nothing about that. In fact, they have been complicit in allowing this to happen. Proportionately, China may be more heavily in debt than we are, yet it is still managing to invest heavily in infrastructure, local businesses, and local jobs. Its creative accounting scheme seems to be working for the Chinese. While the rest of the world suffers from an unrelenting credit crunch, China's banks today are on a lending binge. The rush to make new loans is a direct response to the government's economic stimulus policy, which emphasizes infrastructure and internal development. The Chinese government was able to get its banks to open their lending windows when U.S. banks were being tight-fisted with their funds because the government owns the banks. The Chinese banking system has been partially privatized, but the government is still the controlling shareholder of the big four commercial banks, which were split off from the People's Bank of China in the 1980s. We might take a lesson from the Chinese and put our own banks to work for the people, rather than making the people work for the banks. We need to get our dollars out of Wall Street and back on Main Street. And we can do that by breaking up Wall Street's out-of-control private banking monopoly and returning control over money and credit to the people themselves. We could also take a lesson from the Chinese and dispose of our debt with a little creative accounting. When the bonds come due, we could pay them with dollars issued by the Treasury, in the same way that the Federal Reserve issued Federal Reserve notes to save Wall Street with its quantitative easing program following the 2008 bank bailout. The mechanics of that process were revealed in a remarkable segment on National Public Radio on August 26, 2010, describing how a team of Fed employees bought $1.25 trillion in mortgage bonds beginning in late 2008. According to NPR, the Fed was able to spend so much money so quickly because it has a unique power. It can create money out of thin air whenever it decides to do so. So, the mortgage team would decide to buy a bond, they'd push a button on the computer, and voila, money is created. If the Fed can do it to save the banks, the Treasury could do it to save the taxpayers. We need to reclaim our sovereign right to fund the commonwealth without getting entangled in debt to foreign creditors through the use of our own government-issued currency and publicly owned banks. Ellen Brown is the author of Web of Debt, The Shocking Truth About Our Money System and How We Can Break Free. For more information, see www.webofdebt.com.